The sound of breaking glass echoed through the dimly lit restaurant as the angry customer's voice grew louder, his finger jabbing aggressively toward the quiet man sitting alone in the corner booth. Nobody in the packed dining room seemed willing to intervene as the situation escalated, except for one waitress who was about to make a decision that would cost her everything she thought she knew about her life, but lead to something she never could have imagined. What happened next would change not just her destiny, but reveal the true character of a world-famous musician who had been watching silently from the shadows. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell me in the comments below what city you're watching from and how old you are. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because you won't believe how this story ends. The night started like any other at Moonbeam Diner in Asheville, North Carolina. The small establishment wasn't the kind of place that attracted celebrities or important people. Tucked away from the tourist areas, it survived on regular customers and locals who appreciated its honest food and unpretentious atmosphere. The staff knew the unwritten rules perfectly. Don't upset influential customers, don't draw unnecessary attention, and especially don't create problems that could cost an entire evening's revenue. Indigo had been working there for 6 years, pulling long shifts and depending on that salary to keep her basic routine in order. At 27, she wasn't someone who involved herself in conflicts and never sought the spotlight. That evening, she simply noticed that a customer was being treated with a complete lack of respect and acted directly without raising her voice, without insults, just asking for the situation to stop. André Rieu had entered the restaurant without announcing who he was. He chose a discreet table, ordered something simple, and made it clear through his demeanor that he wanted no attention. He wasn't there as an artist or as a public figure. He was tired, observing more than he spoke, just trying to end the evening in silence. The problem began when another customer decided to turn that space into his personal stage. Aggressive comments, sarcasm, and provocations began appearing without any clear reason. The atmosphere quickly became tense, but nobody intervened. The employees looked away. The other customers remained silent, and the restaurant owner observed everything from a distance, only evaluating the financial impact of the situation. When Indigo stepped between them, she wasn't thinking about who André was, but about what was happening before her eyes. It was enough for the owner to understand it as a break in hierarchy. For him, it didn't matter who was right. What mattered was who paid more. The firing was immediate, without discussion, without any attempt to resolve the situation. A quick gesture to show control. The customer was still screaming when the manager pointed toward the door and said loudly that the waitress was fired because she was meddling in matters that didn't concern her, making it clear that in that restaurant, nobody defended someone like André Rieu without paying a price. She tried to explain that she had only asked for respect, that nobody was doing anything wrong, but was interrupted with a "pack your things and leave now," said without hesitation in front of everyone. While she removed her apron with trembling hands and heard whispers around her, André remained seated in silence, observing the entire scene without saying a word. The manager believed he had settled the matter there, but what he didn't realize was that the firing had just caused a reaction from André that would turn that evening into merely the beginning of something nobody in that restaurant could later control. Indigo was thrown out, while the restaurant continued as if nothing had happened. What nobody there realized at that moment was that André had followed every detail, not just the spoken words, but the reactions, the silence, and the ease with which someone could be discarded for doing what was right. He didn't argue, didn't stand up, and didn't try to prevent the firing. But contrary to what the restaurant owner believed, that story hadn't ended when the door closed behind the waitress. For André, it had just begun. The tension in the backstage area was palpable, though nobody said it out loud. Team members exchanged meaningful glances while performing their tasks. Sage, a colleague of Indigo's who worked in the back kitchen, had seen everything through the doorway. She had known Indigo for years, knew how hard she worked and how little she involved herself in drama. What she had just witnessed wasn't fair, but Sage also knew that intervening would put her own position at risk. Orion, the owner, walked back to the bar with misplaced satisfaction. For him, the problem had been solved efficiently. One less employee, one satisfied customer, and routine maintained. He didn't consider that someone might care about the way everything had been handled. Jasper, the influential customer, ordered another drink and laughed loudly with his tablemates. He had made his point, demonstrated his power. The fact that someone had lost their job because of his behavior didn't seem to affect him. On the contrary, it seemed to strengthen him. Sterling, the manager who had carried out the firing, tried to hide his discomfort. He had only followed orders from Orion, but something about the way Indigo had looked at him before leaving lingered in his thoughts. It hadn't been anger, but disappointment, and that was somehow worse. André observed all this from his table. His facial expression revealed nothing, but his thoughts worked quickly. He had experienced many different situations in his long career, but there was something about this scene that touched him on a fundamental level. It wasn't just the injustice, it was the ease with which it had happened, the absence of doubt or concern. Outside the restaurant, Indigo began walking slowly, her feet moving automatically, while her mind tried to process what had just happened. The evening air was cold, and she had left her jacket inside in her rush to leave. The apron she carried under her arm was the only tangible proof of what she had just lost. She thought about the bills that would be due soon, about the rent that had to be paid next week, about how she would explain to her neighbor, who sometimes helped her, that she was now without work. The thoughts came quickly, each adding extra weight to her shoulders. But there was also something else, deeper, a feeling of confusion about how quickly everything had gone, how little her years of dedication had counted when it mattered. She had thought that hard work and honesty had value, but tonight she had learned that power counted more than both. Inside the restaurant, the service continued. Plates were brought to tables, orders taken. Forced laughter sounded as if nothing had happened. Sage did her work with mechanical precision, her thoughts elsewhere. Every time she walked through the dining room, she avoided looking toward Jasper's table. Orion controlled the register, satisfied with the evening's revenue. For him, this was just business, nothing personal. He had made a decision that protected his profitability, and that was all that counted. The human cost of that decision didn't appear on his balance sheet. André paid his bill and stood up to leave. Orion tried to approach him, perhaps to smooth over the incident with a polite gesture. But André only nodded and walked toward the door without exchanging words. His silence said far more than any complaint could have been. When he came outside, he saw Indigo still there, standing by the entrance, breathing deeply to force herself to leave. The image affected him more than he had expected. Here was someone who had risked everything for a principle, and the price had been immediate and devastating. He approached slowly, his footsteps soft on the sidewalk. Indigo looked up, surprised that he was still there. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that look an entire conversation was exchanged without words. Understanding, recognition, respect. André spoke first, his voice calm and without drama. He said he had seen what happened and that she had done nothing wrong. Indigo tried to respond, but her voice broke, so she just nodded. The simple gesture of recognition meant more to her than she could express. Then André did something that would change the course of both their lives. He took a card from his pocket and gave it to her. It was a simple white card with black letters, but what was written on it would turn her world upside down. He asked her to call at a specific time the next day and said he would like to hear her version of events calmly. There were no big promises, no exaggerated gestures, just a simple request for contact. Indigo took the card more out of politeness than expectation. She didn't fully understand what this meant or why this famous musician would care about her situation. It seemed too unreal to be true. André wished her a good night and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the street. Indigo remained standing under a streetlight, the card in her hand as if it were an artifact from another universe. For Orion, comfortable back in his office counting the evening's money, this exit was of no importance. He believed he had solved the problem with efficiency. One less employee, one satisfied customer, and routine maintained. He didn't consider that someone might care about the way everything had been handled, nor that the consequences of his decision had just begun. Indigo walked through the city streets without really knowing where she was going. Her feet moved automatically, following a route she had taken thousands of times. But tonight, everything felt different. The familiar buildings seemed strange, the streets too quiet, as if the world itself had changed in the past hours. The apron under her arm felt heavier than it should be, not because of the material, but because of what it represented. Years of service, thousands of hours of hard work, countless customers served with a smile even on the most difficult days, all negated in a single moment of honesty. She reached her small apartment on the third floor of an old building. The stairs creaked under her feet, a sound that was normally comforting in its familiarity, but tonight only sounded empty. She opened the door and stepped inside, not bothering to turn on the light. Indigo sat at the kitchen table, and placed the apron in front of her next to the card André had given her. She stared at both objects as if they were puzzle pieces that didn't fit in the same puzzle. One represented her past, now abruptly ended. The other represented what exactly? A possibility, a politeness, a moment of humanity that would mean nothing in the light of day. Hours ticked by and Indigo didn't sleep. She sat there, thoughts spinning in circles, each time returning to the same point. What should she have done differently? Keep her mouth shut while someone was treated unfairly? Look away and pretend nothing concerned her? The questions had no satisfying answers. When dawn began to filter through the small kitchen window, she made a decision. She would call the number on the card, not because she expected anything to come of it, but because it was the least she could do after André's gesture. But first, she had to do something else. She picked up her phone and called Sage, her only real friend in the restaurant. It took several rings before Sage answered, her voice sleepy and confused. "Indigo, what's wrong? It's not even 6 o'clock. Sorry for waking you, I just had to talk to someone." There was a pause on the other side of the line, and then Sage's voice sounded clearer, more alert. "What happened last night wasn't fair. Everyone knows that. Everyone knowing wasn't enough to stop it. Indigo, you know Orion, you know how he is. Power and money are the only things that count for him. I know, and that's exactly why I don't regret what I did, even if it cost me my job." Sage sighed, a sound full of frustration and sadness. "What are you going to do now?" Indigo looked at the card on the table. "I don't know exactly, but there's something I need to find out." After ending the conversation, Indigo prepared for the day. She showered, dressed, and made coffee, all with mechanical movements that didn't really require concentration. Her thoughts were elsewhere, anticipating the phone call she would have to make. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, the day began like any other. Orion arrived early, as always, to check deliveries and inspect lunch preparations. Sterling, the manager, was already there, making lists and checking tables. "Have you found someone to take Indigo's place?" asked Orion without looking up from his papers. "I called a few people. There should be 2 interviews today." "Good, we don't have much time. The weekend is coming, and we need full staff." Sterling hesitated before speaking. "Orion, about last night. Don't you think maybe we acted too quickly?" Orion finally looked up, his expression hard. "Too quickly? An employee disrespects a customer, and you think we acted too quickly? If I had let her stay longer, what message would that send to the rest of the staff? But she was only defending someone who was being treated unfairly. That's not her decision to make. Her job is to serve, not judge customers." Sterling said nothing more, but the discomfort on his face was clear. He remembered how Indigo had looked at him before she left, the disappointment in her eyes. It continued to bother him more than he wanted to admit. In the kitchen, Sage organized her workstation with more force than necessary, setting down pots and pans with tortured sounds that betrayed her frustration. The other cooks glanced meaningfully at each other, but said nothing. Everyone knew what had happened the night before, and everyone had their own opinion about it, but nobody wanted to risk speaking their heart out. At exactly the time André had specified, Indigo picked up her phone and called the number on the card. Her heart pounded as she waited for the connection, half expecting that nobody would answer, that this had all been a mistake or misunderstanding. But then, after 2 rings, she heard his voice. André speaking. "Mr. Rieu, this is Indigo, the waitress from last night. You asked me to call." "Ah, Indigo, thank you for calling. Do you have time to talk?" "Yes, I have all the time in the world now." There was something in the way she said it, a mixture of bitterness and sadness, that made André pause before responding. When he spoke, his voice was soft, more personal. "Indigo, I want you to tell me what happened last night, from beginning to end, but not the version you think I want to hear. The truth in your own words." And so Indigo began to tell. She told about André's arrival at the restaurant, about how Jasper had started with his provocations, about the moment when she decided to step between them. She told about Orion's anger, about the immediate firing, about the feeling of injustice that had overwhelmed her. André listened without interrupting, only occasionally humming to indicate he was listening attentively. When Indigo finished, there was a brief silence before he spoke. "Indigo, what you did last night was rare, not because it was difficult, but because it had a price. And you did it anyway. Most people would have looked away. And maybe they were right. Now I have no job and no idea how I'm going to pay my bills." "That's true. But you still have something that's more valuable than a job in that restaurant." "What's that?" "Your integrity. And that, my dear, is something nobody can take away from you. Not even Orion with all his power." Indigo felt tears welling up in her eyes at these words. It was the first moment since the previous evening that someone had acknowledged that what she had done had value, that it hadn't just been a mistake. "Mr. Rieu, I appreciate your kind words, but kind words don't pay rent." "That's true. That's why I want to ask you to meet with me tomorrow. There's something we need to discuss, but not over the phone. Do you know the cafe on Grove Street?" "Yes, I know where that is." "Perfect. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Can you make it?" "I think so. Yes, I can do that." "Excellent. Until then, Indigo. And don't worry. Sometimes the things that seem worst are actually hidden opportunities." After the conversation ended, Indigo sat with the phone in her hand, trying to process what had just happened. A meeting with André Rieu to discuss something. What could he possibly have to discuss with her? Meanwhile, at the restaurant, the lunch service began. The first customers started trickling in, and the usual bustle of a normal workday began, but there was something different in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Sage noticed it first. Customers who normally asked for Indigo looked around confused when an unfamiliar face took their orders. Some asked where she was, and Sterling had to give vague answers about schedules and staff changes, but it was more than that. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. The automatic warmth that Indigo had always brought was missing, and without it, the space seemed colder, less inviting. Customers might not notice it consciously, but they felt it. At 2 p.m., Jasper arrived for lunch. Sterling greeted him with the same attention as always, escorting him to his favorite table, but there was a forced quality to his politeness that hadn't been there before. Jasper ordered without consulting the menu and leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who knows his presence is valued. He didn't notice Indigo's absence, or if he did, it gave him no concern. But Sage, who could see his table from the kitchen, noticed him. And for the first time in her years of working in that restaurant, she felt something she had never felt before. Real dislike for a customer. Not just irritation or frustration, but deep, visceral dislike. She knew she couldn't do anything. She had her own bills to pay, her own responsibilities. But knowing didn't change the feeling. Indigo's firing had broken something in the silent acceptance that had made it possible for all of them to work under Orion's regime. As the day transitioned into evening, and Indigo prepared to sleep, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts full of questions about what the next day would bring. André's card lay on her nightstand, a tangible reminder that this was all real, not just a strange dream. At the restaurant, Orion closed the doors after the last customer had left. He counted the register, satisfied with the day's proceeds. For him, everything was normal, everything as it should be. The brief disruption of the previous evening was forgotten, replaced by the everyday routine of business. But what Orion didn't realize, and what nobody in that restaurant understood, was that the consequences of Indigo's firing had just begun. The first ripples of change were barely perceptible, but they were there, spreading outward in ways nobody could yet foresee. The next morning, Indigo woke before her alarm went off. She had dreamed of the restaurant, of endless shifts where she could never keep up with orders, where customers screamed, and Orion accused her of mistakes she hadn't made. It was a relief to wake up, even into the uncertainty of her actual situation. She prepared carefully for the meeting, choosing clothes that were professional but not formal, not sure what the appropriate dress code was for a meeting with a world-famous musician in a cafe. Everything she had seemed either too casual or too dressed up. Eventually, she chose a simple blouse and skirt that gave her a kind of middle ground. The cafe on Grove Street was a place Indigo knew but rarely visited. It was somewhat more expensive than the places where she normally drank her coffee, frequented by a more affluent clientele. When she entered exactly at 10 o'clock, she scanned the space looking for André. He sat at a table by the window, dressed in simple clothes that made him less conspicuous than his stage attire. He saw her immediately and stood up to greet her, a gesture of politeness that surprised and somewhat relaxed her. "Indigo, thank you for coming. Please sit down. Would you like coffee, tea?" "Coffee would be good. Thank you." André signaled to the waitress and then returned his attention to Indigo. There was a moment of silence in which they observed each other. Not uncomfortable, but evaluative, each trying to take a measure of the other. "Indigo, I'll be direct with you. What I saw last night in that restaurant wasn't just a waitress defending a customer. It was someone acting from a fundamental understanding of fairness, even when it was personally costly." Indigo didn't know how to respond to this, so she just nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I'm involved in various projects, as you might know. Not just music, but also things related to hospitality, to creating experiences for people. And one of the things I've learned in all these years is that you can teach technical skills, but you can't teach character. I don't completely understand what you mean. What I mean is that I'm looking for people to be part of my team. Not musicians, but people who understand how to make real connections with people, how to read situations, how to act with integrity, even under pressure. Indigo's heart began beating faster. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? Mr. Rieu, I'm flattered, but I'm just a waitress. I have no experience with the kind of work you're talking about. You underestimate yourself. Experience can be gained. Integrity is innate. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlacing while he observed her attentively. Let me tell you a story. Years ago, when I was just starting, I played in small venues. Places not so different from that restaurant where you worked. One evening there was a technical problem. The sound system went out in the middle of a performance. I could have panicked, could have cancelled, could have shifted the responsibility to others. What did you do? I kept playing without amplification, just my violin and my voice. And you know what? It became one of the most memorable performances of my early career. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Indigo began to understand where he was going. You're saying that what happened last night, though it was terrible, also revealed something valuable. Exactly. Indigo, I'm not offering out of pity or because I think you need to be saved. I'm offering because I think you have something that's rare and valuable. Their coffee arrived and they paused while the waitress set down the cups. Indigo took a sip, using the moment to organize her thoughts. What would this work involve exactly? Initially, you'd work with my events team. We organize everything from private concerts to larger shows, and the experience people have doesn't just depend on the music, but on every interaction they have. You'd be responsible for training staff in hospitality, for handling delicate situations, for ensuring that every person attending our events feels valued, but I have no formal training in that sort of thing. You have years of experience working with people. You've proven you can stay calm in difficult situations, and most importantly, you've shown that you'll do what's right, even when it would be easier to look away. I can't teach you that. You already have it. Indigo felt emotions welling up in her throat. 2 days ago, she had thought her world had ended. Now, here was a man she had only known from afar, offering her a chance she never could have imagined. Why are you doing this, really? André smiled, but it was a sad smile. Because I've seen too often what happens when power and money become more important than humanity. Because I believe we all have a responsibility to stand up when we see injustice. And because honestly, I think you'd be good at this work. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything now. Think about it. Take a few days. But while you think, I want you to consider something. Sometimes the things that seem most terrible are actually the universe giving us a push in a direction we were supposed to be headed all along. They talked for another hour, André explaining details of what the work would involve, the salary, which was considerably more than what she had earned at the restaurant, the expectations and opportunities for growth. The more Indigo heard, the more real it seemed, and the more frightened she became. Indigo, may I ask you something? What's your biggest fear about accepting this? She thought before answering. I think I'm afraid I'll disappoint you, that you're making this offer out of kindness, but that I won't be able to meet what you need. That's a reasonable fear, but let me ask you this. Were you afraid to defend that customer last night? Yes. But you did it anyway? Yes. Then you already know how to deal with fear. You acknowledge it, but you don't let it stop you from doing what's right. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, the day began with a series of small disasters. The dishwasher broke, a delivery was wrong, and 2 staff members called in sick. Sterling tried to juggle everything, but without Indigo's calm presence and efficiency, everything seemed harder than it should be. Sage did her best to fill the gap, taking on extra responsibilities and trying to help the new temporary waitress Orion had hired. But the new woman didn't know the menus, didn't know the regular customers' preferences, and made mistakes Indigo never would have made. By lunch, the restaurant was busy, and the stress began to show. Orders were taken incorrectly, food came out slower than normal, and customers began getting irritated. Jasper arrived for his usual lunch and immediately noticed something was wrong. "Where's the waitress who's normally here?" he asked Sterling. "We've had some changes in staff, but I assure you we'll continue to provide excellent service." Jasper looked skeptical, but said nothing more. He ordered his usual meal and waited. But when the food arrived, it wasn't exactly as he preferred. The steak was slightly overcooked, the sides not at the right temperature. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice rising enough that other customers looked over. "I've been coming here for years, and I've never had such poor service." Sterling rushed to calm the situation, offering to replace the meal. But Jasper wasn't easily placated. He launched into a tirade about falling standards and lack of professionalism, his words echoing around the now silent restaurant. Sage, watching from the kitchen, felt her blood pressure rising. This was the man responsible for Indigo's firing, and now he had the audacity to complain about service. The irony was almost too much to bear. At the cafe, Indigo's meeting with André had extended from coffee to lunch. They talked about everything from her background to his experiences in the music industry, finding common ground in their shared belief in treating people with dignity and respect. "Indigo, I want you to know something," said André as they finished their meal. "If you accept this position, it won't be easy. You'll deal with difficult people, stressful situations, moments when you'll doubt yourself. But if you're willing to do the work, I promise you it will also be rewarding. When would you need a decision? Take the rest of the week. Call me Friday and let me know what you've decided. But Indigo, whatever you decide, I want you to know that what you did in that restaurant had meaning. It had meaning for me, and it should have meaning for you." They parted outside the cafe, André giving her a warm handshake and Indigo walking away with a head full of thoughts and possibilities. The world that had seemed so bleak just 2 days ago now seemed bright with potential. But back at the restaurant, the situation was deteriorating. Jasper's complaint had set off a chain reaction. Other customers began noticing things they would have otherwise ignored. The service was slower, the food not quite right, the atmosphere not as warm as it had been. Orion, watching from his office, began to worry. He had thought replacing Indigo would be simple, just a matter of finding another waitress. But now he realized that what she had brought to the restaurant wasn't so easily replicated. Sage, seeing the stress on her colleagues' faces, waited until her shift ended and then, instead of going straight home, walked to Orion's office. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite her heart pounding. Orion looked up from his papers, surprised by her directness. "About what?" "About what's happening to this restaurant since you fired Indigo. That's not your concern." "It is my concern when it affects the place where I work. Orion, you made a mistake, and every day that passes, that mistake becomes clearer." Orion's face reddened. "I don't take instructions from my staff about how to run my business. I'm not giving you instructions. I'm telling you what everyone here sees but is too afraid to say. Indigo wasn't just another waitress. She was the heart of this place, and without her everything's falling apart. Get out of my office, now." Sage turned to go but paused at the door. "You know, Orion, power can protect you for a while, but eventually, when customers stop coming and staff stops caring, no amount of power will repair that." She left him alone in his office, staring at the door with a feeling of unease he couldn't shake. For the first time since Indigo's firing, Orion began to wonder if he might have overreacted, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that possibility, even to himself. Indigo spent the next few days in a state of constant consideration. André's offer seemed too good to be true, and yet it was real. She had discussed the salary, the responsibilities, even the possibility for growth within the organization. Everything was concrete, tangible, real, but the doubts kept gnawing. She was used to the predictability of restaurant work, to knowing every task and every challenge. This new path was unknown territory, full of risks and uncertainties. What if she failed? What if she disappointed André after everything he had done for her? On Wednesday evening, Indigo decided to take a walk through the city to clear her thoughts. Her feet carried her, almost without conscious choice, through the streets to the neighborhood where the restaurant stood. She hadn't planned to pass by, but now that she was there, she couldn't help looking through the window. What she saw surprised her. The restaurant was only half full, unusual for a Wednesday evening that was normally one of the busiest of the week. The staff she could see moved with a tension that hadn't been there before. Even from outside, she could feel that something fundamental had changed. Sage appeared in her field of vision, balancing a tray while navigating between tables. She looked exhausted, her usual energy replaced by a kind of grim determination. Indigo felt a pang of guilt. Had her leaving caused this? Were her colleagues now suffering more because of her actions? As if sensing Indigo's gaze, Sage looked up and saw her through the window. Their eyes met for a moment, and then a smile broke through on Sage's face. She gestured for Indigo to come inside, but Indigo shook her head and pointed to the cafe down the street. 5 minutes later, Sage slipped outside during a brief break, and joined Indigo at a table outside the cafe. "Indigo, I've missed you. How are you doing?" "I'm managing, and you, it looks tough in there." Sage sighed deeply. "It's a nightmare, Indigo. Since you left, nothing seems to go right. We've had 3 different waitresses, and none of them stays longer than a few days. Customers complain constantly, and Orion gets moodier every day. I'm sorry, Sage, I never wanted—" "Stop that," Sage interrupted. "You have nothing to do with this. This is all Orion's own fault. He thought power was more important than people, and now he's paying the price. But you're paying the price too, maybe. But you know what? It's also opened our eyes. Half the staff is looking for other work. We only stay because we have bills to pay, not because we think this place has a future." Indigo told Sage about André's offer, about the chance she had been given. Sage's eyes grew wide as she listened. "Indigo, that's incredible. You have to accept it. When do you ever get a chance like that again?" "But I'm scared. What if I'm not good enough?" "Not good enough? Indigo, you were the best waitress that restaurant ever had. You can handle anyone, from the most demanding customer to the newest employee. If André Rieu thinks you can do it, who are you to doubt?" Sage's words touched something deep in Indigo. Her fear wasn't really about her ability. It was about letting go of the familiar, about stepping into the unknown. But had the familiar really been so safe? She had been fired on a whim, without warning, without protection. What was safe about that? "You're right," Indigo said slowly. "I think I have to do it." "Of course you have to do it. And Indigo, when you're a big success, don't forget your old friends." They laughed together, a moment of lightness amid the tension. Then Sage had to return to work, and Indigo was left with a new sense of clarity. That evening, Indigo called André 2 days earlier than he had asked. "Mr. Rieu, I've made my decision. I accept your offer." She could hear the smile in his voice when he answered, "I'm glad to hear that, Indigo. When can you start?" "Whenever you need me." "How about next Monday? That gives us the weekend to get everything in order." "Next Monday is perfect." After the conversation, Indigo sat in silence, the full scope of her decision settling over her. She had just completely changed her life, taken a leap into the unknown based on nothing more than faith in a man she barely knew and in herself. But instead of fear, she felt something else. Excitement, hope, a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Thursday evening's rush was in full swing, or at least what passed for rush these days. Tables were only 2/3 full, a sharp contrast to the packed houses they usually had. Sterling stood by the host stand, looking concerned at the empty tables. He'd had reservations that were cancelled, regular customers who had said they were trying elsewhere. Word was getting around that something had changed at the restaurant, and not for the better. Jasper arrived for his weekly dinner, but this time there was no rush to greet him immediately. He had to wait at the entrance for several minutes before someone noticed him. And when he was finally seated, it was at a table that wasn't his usual favorite. "This is unacceptable," he muttered to the new waitress. "I've been coming here for years. I shouldn't have to wait." The waitress, nervous and overwhelmed, mumbled an apology and hurried away to find Sterling. But Sterling was dealing with another crisis in the kitchen where an order had gone wrong. Sage, watching from her position at the bar, felt a surge of satisfaction. Jasper, the man who had caused all this to begin, was now getting a taste of what it felt like to be treated as less than important. She knew she shouldn't have these thoughts, but she couldn't help it. Orion emerged from his office, drawn by Jasper's loud complaints. He rushed to smooth over the situation, personally escorting Jasper to his favorite table and offering to serve his meal on the house. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience," Orion said smoothly. "We're training new staff, but I assure you everything will return to normal soon." Jasper looked at him skeptically. This never would have happened when that other waitress was here. "What was her name again?" "Indigo," Orion said stiffly. "But she doesn't work here anymore." "I can see that, and the restaurant is suffering for it." The words hung in the air between them, an implicit accusation that Orion couldn't ignore. For the first time, he began to wonder if his decision to fire Indigo might have been too hasty, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that doubt, especially not to Jasper. Instead, he forced a smile and assured the customer that everything was under control. Later that evening, after the restaurant had closed and the staff had left, Orion sat alone in his office, looking at the week's figures. Revenue was down 15%, reservations were down 20%, and the online reviews, which had previously been largely positive, were beginning to accumulate negative comments. He tried to reason it away. It was just a temporary setback. Once the new staff was fully trained, things would return to normal. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. What Indigo had brought to the restaurant wasn't just training or experience. It was something intangible, something that couldn't easily be replaced. For the first time since he had opened the restaurant 20 years ago, Orion felt a flash of real concern about the future of his business. He had always believed that as long as he kept the right customers happy, the rest would follow. Now he was beginning to wonder if he might have been focusing on the wrong things all along. Meanwhile, Indigo sat at home, making plans for her new life. She had called André's team to discuss the details of starting, and she was overwhelmed by their warmth and welcome. For the first time in days, she felt that she had made the right decision. Sage came by late in the evening, carrying a bottle of wine to celebrate Indigo's new job. "To new beginnings," toasted Sage, raising her glass. "To new beginnings," echoed Indigo, clinking her glass against Sage's. They sat late into the night, talking, sharing memories of their time together at the restaurant, laughing about the absurd customers and chaotic services. But there was also an underlying tone of sadness, the recognition that a chapter of their lives had closed. "Do you ever think Orion will realize what he's done?" asked Indigo. Sage shook her head. "Men like Orion only realize something when it's too late, and by that time, there's usually nothing left to save. It's tragic, really. The restaurant could have been so good if he had prioritized people over profit, but that's not the point now. For people like Orion, profit is everything, and ironically, that mentality will eventually be his downfall." The words proved more prophetic than either woman realized. Friday began as a normal day at the restaurant, but by midday, it was clear something was seriously wrong. Weekend reservations, normally booked weeks in advance, were dangerously low. Several regular customers had called to cancel their standing reservations, citing various reasons, but all with the same underlying message: they were no longer interested. Sterling sat in Orion's office, reservation books spread between them on the desk. "We have to do something," said Sterling. "If this trend continues, we won't make it through the month." "What do you suggest?" sneered Orion. "That we beg Indigo to come back? That we admit we made a mistake? I suggest we look at why we're losing customers and what we can do to fix it. And yes, maybe that means admitting that firing Indigo was a mistake." Orion's face reddened. "I will never admit I made a mistake. That woman disrespected a paying customer. She got what she deserved. And now we're getting what we deserve. Sterling, you can't keep denying there's a problem. The numbers don't lie. Then we'll have to improve marketing, maybe run some promotions, create some buzz." Sterling sighed, realizing he was talking to a wall. Orion was so invested in his own narrative that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. The restaurant wasn't failing because of lack of marketing. It was failing because its heart had been removed, and no amount of promotions would fix that. That evening, as Indigo prepared to sleep in anticipation of her first day at her new job, she received an unexpected phone call. It was Sterling. "Indigo, I'm sorry to call so late. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Sterling, no, it's okay. What's wrong?" "I just had to let you know something. The restaurant is falling apart without you. Orion will never admit it, but your leaving has left a hole we can't fill." "Sterling, I'm sorry, but I don't know what you want me to do." "Nothing. I want you to do nothing. You're in a better place now, and you deserve that. I called only because I wanted you to know that you mattered. What you did that night defending André, it was right. And the fact that you were punished for it says more about Orion than about you." "Thank you, Sterling, that means a lot. There's something else. Jasper, the customer who started the whole situation, he stopped coming. Apparently even he realized the restaurant isn't the same without you." Indigo wasn't sure how she should feel about this information. There was a part of her that felt satisfaction, but another part felt only sadness for what could have been if Orion had chosen differently. After the conversation ended, Indigo lay awake, thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago she had been fired, thinking her world had ended. Now she was on the verge of a new career, a new life, new possibilities. And the restaurant that had thrown her away was disintegrating, not because of any action of hers, but because of the natural consequence of prioritizing the wrong things. Sometimes, she thought, justice isn't something you have to pursue. Sometimes it just comes in its own time, in its own way. Monday morning, Indigo woke with a mixture of excitement and nerves she hadn't felt in years. Her first day at her new job stretched before her, full of unknown challenges and possibilities. She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional but approachable, and left early to make sure she would arrive on time. The office where André's events team worked was a world away from the restaurant. It was a modern building with glass walls and open spaces where creativity and collaboration were encouraged. When Indigo entered, she was immediately greeted by a friendly receptionist who was expecting her. Phoenix appeared a few moments later, a woman in her early 40s with a warm smile and an efficient manner. She took Indigo on a tour of the office, introduced her to various team members, and explained the structure of the organization. The morning flew by in a blur of introductions, training, and information. Indigo's head was spinning by midday, but she also felt energized in a way she hadn't felt in years. André arrived just before lunch, his presence immediately filling the room with energy. They ate together with the team, and Indigo began to understand the dynamics of the group. There was a sense of shared purpose, a collective commitment to excellence that moved her. In contrast, back at the restaurant, the lunch service was a disaster. 2 waitresses hadn't shown up. Sterling and Sage did their best to fill the gap, but they were hopelessly understaffed. Customers waited longer than reasonable for their food, orders were taken incorrectly, and the general atmosphere was so tense that even the most patient diners began to complain. Orion emerged from his office halfway through lunch, his face red with frustration. Sage turned to him, years of built-up frustration finally boiling over. "Nobody wants to work here, Orion. Since you fired Indigo, we've had 10 different people. You know how many have stayed? None. Consider this my 2 weeks' notice." 2 weeks and then I'm gone. Orion's mouth fell open in shock. Sage had been with him since the beginning. The idea of the restaurant without her was almost unthinkable. Over the next weeks, the situation at the restaurant deteriorated. After Sage's notice, 3 other employees also gave their resignations. Online reviews had changed from largely positive to overwhelmingly negative. Orion tried everything. He hired a PR company, offered promotions, raised salaries, but nothing worked. The problem wasn't lack of marketing. The problem was that the soul of the restaurant had left. Sterling also made the difficult decision to leave. On his last day, he sought out Orion. "You chose power over people, and this is the result." Meanwhile, Indigo flourished in her new role. She had led her first solo event, a small but important private concert, and it had been a resounding success. André had personally congratulated her. Over the months, the contrast between Indigo's new life and her old one became clear. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. 6 months after her first day, Indigo was unrecognizable. She had been promoted to Senior Hospitality Coordinator. Her philosophy was simple: treat people like people, not like resources. Under her leadership, customer satisfaction scores had risen by 35%. The restaurant where she once worked had permanently closed. After months of declining sales, Orion had no choice but to shut down. The building now stood empty, a "for rent" sign in the window. One day, Indigo passed the now closed restaurant. She stopped for a moment, looking at the dark interior. There was no triumph in seeing it, only sadness for what could have been. Later that week, André organized a special gala to raise funds. Indigo was responsible for overseeing the entire hospitality operation, a monumental task. The evening went perfectly. At the end, André sought her out. "Indigo, I'm expanding the organization. I'd like you to lead the new international division." Indigo's mouth fell open. "André, that's..." "Yes, of course. Yes." They embraced, a moment of genuine connection. Indigo realized how far she had come. She had gone from fired waitress to leader in less than a year. A few days later, Indigo received a letter from Orion. "Dear Indigo, I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing simply to say that you were right and I was wrong. That evening you saw what I couldn't, that people are more important than profit. With sincere respect, Orion." Indigo folded the letter slowly. She wrote back, short and simple, wishing him well in whatever came next. 1 year later, Indigo's new division had grown exponentially. She was invited to speak at conferences, to mentor emerging leaders. Sage met her for coffee. "Do you remember that night at the restaurant?" asked Sage. "Did you ever think it would lead to this?" Indigo shook her head. "Not for 1 second. I thought I was ruining my life, but actually, I was saving it." The restaurant reopened eventually under new ownership. The new owners used Indigo's story as a guiding principle. Treat people well and success will follow. Indigo was invited to the grand reopening. She stood in the space where she had spent so many years. "How does it feel to be back?" asked Phoenix. "Strange. Good, but strange. I think the biggest lesson is that sometimes the things that seem the worst are actually the universe pushing us where we need to be. As the evening continued, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her story had begun with firing and injustice, but it had led to growth, success, and a deeper understanding of what was truly important. The legacy of that night continued to ripple outward in ways nobody could have anticipated. Indigo established a scholarship program for hospitality workers who showed exceptional character under pressure, ensuring that others who found themselves in similar situations would have opportunities for growth and advancement. The scholarship became nationally recognized, with André as the honorary chairman. 3 years later, Indigo opened her own consultancy firm, specializing in ethical hospitality management. Her first clients were restaurants and hotels struggling with high turnover and poor customer relations. Her methods were revolutionary, yet simple. Prioritize human dignity over profit margins, invest in employee well-being, and create environments where both staff and customers feel valued. The firm grew rapidly, not just because of Indigo's expertise, but because of her story. Business owners who had heard about the waitress who stood up for what was right, lost everything, and built something better, wanted to learn from her experience. She became a sought-after speaker, her talks focusing on the transformative power of integrity in business. Sage eventually joined Indigo's team as head of training, bringing her own experience and passion for ethical treatment of workers. Together, they developed programs that revolutionized how service industries approached employee relations. André, watching Indigo's continued success from afar, often reflected on that fateful evening. He had thought he was simply helping someone who had shown courage, but Indigo had transformed that help into something much larger. She had become a force for change in an industry often characterized by exploitation and indifference. The original restaurant space was eventually transformed into a community center that offered job training and support services for hospitality workers. A plaque near the entrance told the story of the waitress who chose integrity over security, and how that choice had created ripples of positive change that continued to spread. Years later, when young people in the industry faced their own moments of moral choice, they often remembered Indigo's story. The tale of the waitress and the world-famous musician had become legend, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories begin with what looks like defeat, and that standing up for what's right, even when it costs everything, can plant seeds for a better future than we ever imagined possible. And somewhere in the city, André Rieu continued to perform, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the greatest symphony is not played on a stage, but lived out in the countless small acts of courage that ordinary people choose to make in extraordinary moments.